The Vashik corridor was not a good place to be alone. Most captains who flew it kept their sensors wide open and their hands close to the throttle. The corridor was a long stretch of dead space between two trading systems, useful mostly as a shortcut, dangerous mostly because it was so empty. Nothing lived out there. Nothing drifted there usually except old debris from a war nobody remembered the name of anymore, the kind of place where if something went wrong, it went wrong. Quietly and without witnesses, Voracek has flown it 43 times in his life. He had learned to treat it like a held breath, get through it fast, let the breath out on the other side. He was halfway through when his sensor array lit up a ship small, dead in space. About 900 km off his port side. No running lights. No engine output. Nothing broadcasting except a faint, steady ping from an emergency locator. Not a distress signal. Just the automatic thing that kept transmitting when everything else had stopped. He altered course, up close. The ship was worse than the sensors had suggested. It was a human freighter, one of the older models, a battered, ugly thing with mismatched hull plates that told the story of about 15 different repair jobs done at 15 different ports with whatever materials were cheapest at the time. One of the cargo bay doors had a seal that had warped and never been properly fixed. A section of plating near the engine block was scorched in a way that suggested a fire survived and then patched over rather than replaced. The whole ship looked like it had been kept together by stubbornness alone. The cargo bay was venting, not catastrophically, just a slow, steady seep of atmosphere through a crack in the secondary hull, enough to be a problem, enough eventually to become a very serious one. Voracek has docked and boarded with his first officer and 2 crew members. They expected to find something bad, a body, maybe an injured pilot, a situation. What they found was a human sitting in the pilot's seat in a patched EVA suit, with the helmet resting on the console. Beside her, she was reading something on a small handheld screen, the kind with a cracked corner that had been repaired with tape rather than replaced. She looked up when they came through the door, not startled, not relieved, just calm. The way someone is calm when they have been waiting a long time and have made their peace with the waiting. She was young for a human, which Voracek has found difficult to judge. Brown hair pulled back in the way of someone who thought about function and not much else. Eyes that moved over the 4 of them quickly, taking stock and then settled on Voracek. Has the way I settle on whoever is clearly in charge. Captain, she said, thank you for stopping. Your bay is venting. Voracek has said, I know, hull stress fracture. I patched it from outside, but the patch won't hold more than a few hours. She set the reader down on the console, face up, as if she expected to get back to it shortly. I need 40 L of thruster fuel and 6 hours of your cruise time. I can pay half with minerals. I have a decent load and the other half with something more useful. Voracek has looked at her. His people, the Voracek, were not small. He stood a full head and a half taller than her, with the broad, gray-plated build of a species that had spent several thousand years surviving difficult conditions. She did not appear to find this particularly interesting. What is more useful than minerals? He said. Information. She gestured toward the navigation screen to her left. You've been running the Vashik corridor for, I'm guessing, at Least 10 years. Based on the wear pattern on your port. Thruster casings, which means you've been running it on old Drethian shipping. Lane charts, those charts are out of date by about 8 months, Vorthek has. Was quiet for a moment. The Drethian shipping lanes were the backbone of freight movement in this sector. If they had shifted and he was still running old charts, he had been losing time on every single run, possibly routing around safety margins that no longer existed in the right places. How do you know the charts are wrong? He said. Because I have been flying the updated route for 6 months. I mapped it myself. She looked at him steadily. Give me the fuel and 6 hours of your cruise time to help me seal the bay properly, and I will give you everything I have. New charts, updated hazard markers, and the 3 waypoints the Drethian Commercial Guild hasn't published yet because they're still negotiating exclusive access to them. Vorthek has been a cargo captain for 9 years following a military career that had left him with more respect for practical intelligence than formal rank. This human had identified the wear pattern on his thruster casings from across a docking bay and used it to reconstruct his flight history. She was sitting in a venting ship in the middle of empty space reading a book, as if she had calculated that someone would come and had decided there was no point in panicking about the things you couldn't change. He gave her the fuel. His crew spent 4 hours on the hull repair instead of 6 because they were good at their jobs. And the human Wren, she said her name was Wren Calloway, turned out to know more about structural patching than any of them had expected. She didn't give orders. She worked alongside them and occasionally said things like, if you anchor it there, the vibration from the engine will work the seal loose in about 3 weeks, in a voice that was only helpful and not at all interested in making anyone feel bad for not knowing. When it was done, she transferred the charts, the waypoints, and the mineral payment. She shook Vorthek's hand with the grip of someone who had learned to shake hands with species that could bend metal. Safe flight, she said. And to you, he said. He flew away. He ran the new charts. The route was better by 40 minutes, and the updated hazard markers were worth more than the fuel and crew hours he'd spent. He thought about the human for about 2 days, the way you think about someone who surprises you. And then the galaxy got busy and he moved on. The port on Thession 4 smelled like engine grease and overripe grain, and the particular kind of desperation that settles into places where a lot of people arrive with big plans and leave with smaller ones. Sale was 26 years old and running 3 ships and absolutely not in a position to take on charity cases. She told herself this clearly and firmly on the morning she found a human sitting on the dock outside Bay 14 with a kit bag between her feet and the face of someone who had done their math, and the math was not good. You're sitting outside my bay, Sale said. I know, the human said. I'm looking for short-term labor, 3 days. I can do hull maintenance, navigation, calibration, cargo work, or general crew if you need the bodies. I'll work for a berth and 1 meal a day, no credits required. Sale looked at her. The human was fine, steady looking, not sick, not impaired, not the kind of desperate that got dangerous. The tools on her belt were quality good tools, the kind that cost real money, which meant she'd had money at some point and knew how to use them. The fact that she was offering to work for a bunk and a meal rather than begging said she understood the Difference between charity and trade. Sale ran 3 ships on margins tight, enough to make her eye twitch on a good day. 3 days, she said, bay workin'. Manifest review, you sleep in the 3rd. Crew bunkin', you eat what the crew eats. That's fair, the human said, and picked up her bag. Her name was Wren. Sale's first officer Preth took a dislike to her immediately on the grounds that she was quiet in a way that made him uncomfortable, which Sale found amusing rather than concerning. Preth distrusted anything he couldn't read at a glance. This human was not readable at a glance. She worked clean and fast. Bay maintenance on the 2nd ship took her a day and a half instead of the projected 3 because she reorganized the work order in a way that removed 2 redundant steps that nobody had questioned because nobody had looked at the process fresh in years. She didn't announce this. She just did it and moved on to the cargo manifest. The manifest on the 3rd ship had an error buried in it that had been sitting there for 11 months, a small thing, a navigation calibration note in the secondary systems that was technically wrong, technically not dangerous, but was causing a drift compensation issue that added 3% fuel burn to every single run. Sales engineers had flagged it twice. Both times it went to the bottom of the fix list because it wasn't urgent. Wren fixed it on day 2. She didn't mention it. Sales chief engineer found it during a routine check on day 4 after the human had already gone and came to Sales' office with the look of someone who has found something they don't know how to file the calibration error on Ship 3, the engineer said. It's been corrected, I know, Sales said, because she had already worked this out. It was the human, yes, the engineer looked at her. She didn't charge for it. No, Sales said she didn't. She thought about this for a long time. Afterward, it wasn't that the fix was particularly valuable on its own, worth something. Over the course of a year, certainly, but not something that changed her life. What stayed with Sale in the useful, itching way that things stay with a merchant who is good at her work was the principle of it. The human had seen a problem, she had the skill to fix it. She fixed it, she expected nothing. Sale had been in trade her entire life. She dealt in value and margins and what things were worth. She could not work out what this human thought she was doing. She tried to contact her registration number Wren had filed with the Bay office was genuine, but the forwarding address led to a mail relay 3 systems away that routed to nowhere. Sale filed the contact information under a label she created in her own language. It translated roughly as one to watch. The outer rim did not look the way people who had never been there expected it to. Most people imagined it as something dramatic, deep black alien stars, the real edge of the mapped world. In truth, it looked mostly like space. Everywhere else looked, except the stars were more spread out in the silence on the comms was a different quality of silence. Less like nothing was there, more like nothing was listening. Wren had been out here for 6 days. She had good charts, the kind she'd built herself over years, of running routes nobody else wanted. But the cluster she was trying to reach was beyond the edge of any chart she had. It was not on any registry, not on any trade route, not on any survey map she had found in 3 years of searching. She was not lost in the immediate sense of not knowing where she was. She was lost in the sense of not knowing where to go from here. She was sitting with this problem and a cup of cold coffee She kept meaning to reheat when the ship appeared on her scanner. It did not arrive. That was the only word for it. It did not come from a direction, did not decelerate from any previous speed. It simply was not there, and then it was. Her scanner blinked at it twice as if unsure how to categorize what had just happened. It was enormous, not military. Enormous, not the aggressive bulk of a warship, but the enormous of something very old and very certain of itself. The kind of size that comes not from building big, but from simply being around long enough to accumulate. The hull was dark and covered in markings she couldn't read from this distance, not paint, not raised plating. Something carved directly into the material of the ship itself. Keel. She had heard of them. Most people in the freight lanes had. The way you hear of things that are mostly legend, rarely seen, older than most civilizations currently operating. Navigators without equal who move through space by methods no one else fully understood. She had never expected to see one. A channel opened. The voice was low, and even without the modulation of translation software, it spoke her language, the way someone speaks, a language they learned from being around it, not from being taught. You are at the edge, the voice said. Yes, Ren said. Most species do not come to the edge without a destination. I have a destination. I just don't have charts to it. A pause. Not a processing pause. The kind that means something is being decided. What cluster? She gave the coordinates, not from a chart, from calculations she had worked out over 3 years, from old survey fragments and dead reckoning. Another pause. Longer. Why does a human want to go there? She looked at the massive, ancient ship on her scanner. She thought about the careful answer, the one that would sound reasonable and researched. Then she thought about the quality of silence in this part of space, and about what happened when you lied to something very old because no one has. She said the channel was quiet long enough that she thought it had closed. Then wait. She waited 17 minutes. Later, a data packet arrived in her navigation system. Not standard format. The coordinate system was older. The markers in a notation she had to work out as she went, but the information was complete. More than complete. The cluster was mapped in detail with approach vectors, gravitational notes, and 3 separate markings in a language she couldn't read, which she suspected were hazard warnings. Safe passage, the voice said. The keel ship was gone before she could answer. Not departed, gone the same way it had arrived. Ren sat with the data packet for a while. Then she went where the charts led her. The cluster was everything she had worked 3 years to find, and she spent 11 days there alone, mapping and measuring and taking samples, and she did not think much about the keel ship or about Voreths or about the Theshian merchant. She had a job to do. She did it. The years that followed were full and hard, and occasionally very nearly the end of her in ways she did not write down in any official log. She ran routes nobody else ran. She found things nobody else was looking for. She built a reputation that was not flashy and not famous, but was the kind that moved through the freight lanes by word of mouth, the kind where people said things like talk to the human. She knows the outer rim, and if Calloway tells you the route is clear, it's clear. She did not forget the names of people who had helped her. This was not a policy, not a philosophy, just the way she was built. A Voreth captain who gave her fuel in 6 hours, a Theshian merchant who gave her 3 days of work in a bunk, a keel. Navigator who gave her charts to a place he had no reason to care about, she kept. Track not in any written record, not in a ledger or a file, just in the way some people keep track of things in the place where things go that actually matter. The galaxy was large and she was one small ship in it, and she went on, but she remembered they never expected to see the human again, most species who offered small kindnesses to passing strangers didn't. That was the first mistake. 22 years is a long time in the freight lanes. Ships changed, routes changed. Whole systems shifted from backwater to busy or from busy to dead quiet, depending on which resource got discovered where, which government collapsed, which war started, and which one ended. The galaxy had a way of rearranging itself every decade or so in ways that made old maps useless and old assumptions dangerous. Vorath's had watched it happen 3 times. He was 61 years old by the Vorath count, which translated to something in the mid-hundreds by human scale, though he had never been interested enough to work out the precise conversion. He had gray in the plating along his jaw and shoulders that hadn't been there when he was 40. His knees ached in a way they hadn't when he was flying. His eyes were still good. Vorath's eyes stayed good long after everything else started complaining, and he used them now to watch the landing field from the chair outside the front of his house, which was where he spent most of his mornings. His wife thought he watched the landing field because he missed flying. He watched it because he had never been able to stop watching the sky. He had been retired for 3 years. Officially, he had sold his 4th ship, the one he'd run for 11 years, the one after the one he'd been flying when he met the human, to a younger captain who was starting out and needed a vessel that could take hard use. The price had been fair. The goodbye had been the kind that felt more permanent than he'd expected. 3 years he was fine. He had the house and the landing field view, and his wife and his children, who were grown and busy, and his grandchildren, who were noisy and wonderful and thoroughly exhausting. He was fine. His granddaughter, Meth Sarrel, had passed her navigation exams 4 months ago. She was 17, too young in his view to be thinking about a flight career. But the Vorath Flight Authority disagreed, and they were the ones with the certification papers, so his view on the matter was mostly decorative. She had scored a perfect orbital calculation, first Vorath in 40 years to manage it. He knew because he had been there. He had sat in the back of the examination room trying not to look like he was holding his breath. He was holding his breath. He had not told many people about the exam result. It felt private in the way things feel private when they mean more to you than you want to show. The morning the transmission came, he was doing what he usually did, watching the landing field, drinking the hot drink his doctor had told him to replace his coffee with, which tasted like warm paper with ambitions. When the unit on the shelf behind him lit up, he almost didn't look at it. It was old hardware, the personal comms unit he'd run for 20 years on the ship, retired. When he retired, sitting on the shelf, because he'd never gotten around to pulling the power cell. It shouldn't have been active. He hadn't given the frequency to anyone in years. Notification light blinked steady. Patient, he got up and looked at the screen. An incoming transmission. The routing header was a style he recognized from the Outer Rim. Freight lanes, not military, not commercial. The unofficial kind that people who spent a lot of time in deep space used because the official channels had too many eyes on them. He opened it. "Captain Vorethks," said a voice. He hadn't heard it in 22 years. He knew it anyway, the way you know the sound of specific weather, not by thinking about it, just by the feeling it sends through your chest before your mind has caught up. The human said his full name, his clan name, the one he had stopped using after the war, the one he had not given her when they met on the Vashik corridor all those years ago. She had found it. She had also learned the correct honorific, the specific one, the one used for a Voreth who had held military rank in, then chosen to leave it, and she used it correctly in his own language, in the right tone. "I heard your granddaughter passed her navigation exams," Ren Calloway said. "First Voreth in 40 years to score a perfect orbital calculation. I thought you should know." "I heard." A brief pause. "That's all." Transmission ended. Voreth stood in the middle of his living room for a long time. She had not asked for anything. She had not worked up to a request. She had not offered information or trade or any of the other currencies they had dealt in 22 years ago. She had called an old retired cargo captain on a dead frequency, spoken his full name correctly, and told him that someone she had never met, his granddaughter, born years after their single meeting, had done something worth knowing about. He sat back down in his chair. He looked at the landing field for a time. He thought about a patched EVA suit, a cracked handheld reader, 40L of thruster fuel, and the most useful route charts he had ever been given. He thought about the fact that she had remembered him 22 years later without needing anything from him. She had simply remembered him and decided that piece of good news about his family was worth a transmission across however many star systems had come between them. His wife came in from the back of the house and found him very still in his chair. "What's wrong?" she said. "Nothing," he said, and then, because she knew him and because it was true, "I'm trying to understand what kind of person does that." His wife sat down across from him. "Does what?" He thought about it for a moment. "Pays attention," he said. Finally, Sale was 38 and running 9 ships, and her patience for complications had been precisely calibrated over the years. She had exactly enough for the complications that were her own fault, and exactly none for the kind that came from outside. The Vorgan compact was outside. They had been in a low-grade trade dispute with her Eastern Corridor operation for 8 months. It was the kind of dispute that was less about any specific grievance and more about the fact that the compact wanted her routes and had decided the best way to get them was to make operating them expensive enough that she'd eventually sell. They were doing this through a steady series of Trade Council complaints, all technically valid, all technically minor, all designed to accumulate into a weight that would cost her more in legal fees and arbitration time than the routes were worth. Her lawyers were good. Her lawyers were not cheap, and they were telling her the case was winnable, but that the winning of it would take 18 months and cost her in ways she would feel. She was going over the quarterly numbers with Preth one morning. Preth, who was still her first officer because she trusted him even when he annoyed her, which was often. When the report arrived, it came through standard commercial mail. The sender was an independent trade arbitration broker she had never heard of. Registered in the Outer Rim Independent System, the subject line read, Vorgan Compact Counterposition. Analysis Sector 7 Roots, she. Opened it, 42 pages. The most precisely argued commercial. Trade documents she had read in her career, and she had read many of them. Because being good at her job required reading a great many documents. It addressed every single Vorgan Compact complaint and took apart the statistical basis under each one and demonstrated with the kind of mathematical precision that made lawyers' eyes water in the good way that the compacts claimed damages were overstated by factors ranging from 400%, depending on the specific complaint. It also included 3 pieces of root usage data that sale did not have and had not known existed, data that, if submitted to the Trade Council, would flip the case from times her winning, eventually times to times her winning, decisively, and soon. She read it twice. Then she looked at the broker registration number at the top of the document. The search took 4 minutes and then returned a result she read 3 times because she was certain she was misreading it. The registration was genuine. The broker license was valid. It had been issued to a human commercial operator in the Outer Rim Registry. The license had been closed 6 years ago. Sale sat back in her chair, breath, looked at her face and put down the quarterly report. What is it? He said. She didn't answer. She was doing the kind of calculation she was very good at, not the number kind, but the people kind, the kind where you lay a series of events next to each other and ask what shape they make. She had given a human named Ren Calloway 3 days of work and a bunk and 3 meals 22 years ago. The human had fixed a calibration error without being asked, without mentioning it, without expecting anything for it. And now she could not prove this. The license was dead. There was no trail that would hold up in any formal process. Something that carried the fingerprints of that human had delivered a case-winning document in a dispute she hadn't discussed outside her own legal team. Nothing, she said. Good news. She filed the report with her lawyers. That afternoon, the case was resolved in 11 weeks. She told no one. The analyst's name was Keth Vore, and she worked in the Galactic Trade Council's internal security division, which was less interesting than it sounded. Mostly it was data, mostly it was watching patterns in commercial activity across 200 member systems and flagging the things that didn't fit. She was very good at finding things that didn't fit. This particular pattern had taken her 6 months to notice and another 4 to believe. It was subtle, the kind of subtle that is invisible when you look at any one case on its own, visible only when you pull back far enough to see the shape of all of them together. 17 separate incidents across the past 20 years, different systems, different species, different scales. In each one, a commercial operator, a government official, or a private citizen from one of 17 different species had received some form of assistance, information, and introduced contact, a corrected document, a useful piece of knowledge that arrived at precisely the moment it was most useful from a source that was difficult or impossible to trace. And in Clear's throat each case, this was the part that had taken her longest to establish. The recipient had at some point in the previous 10 to 20 years offered some form of help to a human freight operator working under the name R. Callaway or a close variation of that. Registration, 17 incidents, 17 different species. One connecting variable, she wrote the report with care. She titled it Anomaly Persistent Human Reciprocity Pattern. She included all 17 cases with supporting data for each, and she ended with a conclusion that noted in the measured language her division required that the pattern suggested either a highly organized and long-running influence operation by a human commercial operator or something more difficult to categorize. She submitted it up the chain. Her supervisor read it. That same day, he was a Morani. 60 years in council administration. He had seen many things and had developed over those decades a very accurate internal scale for what mattered and what didn't. He read the report with patience. He wrote one line. In the margin, humans, sentimental species, no strategic significance. He filed it under low priority. Hegemony's announcement came on a Tuesday. It was not framed as an expansion. The hegemony rarely framed things as what they actually were. It was framed as a territorial integrity declaration concerning the outer reach systems, which was the political language for we want this space. We intend to take it, and we would prefer not to fight about it, but we are prepared to. The outer reach was a cluster of 7 systems on the far edge of settled space, mostly empty. A few mining operations, a handful of colonial settlements, small ones, the kind that had been there 2 or 3 generations, built by people who wanted distance from the crowded inner systems, including one human colony, 40,000 people, 3rd generation, born there, grown up there, buried their parents there. People whose whole idea of home was a rust-colored world on the edge of the mapped galaxy. The hegemony's declaration included a standard relocation clause, 60 days for non-hegemony populations to clear the affected systems. The language was clean and bureaucratic. The way language is when the people writing it are careful not to think about what it means for the people it actually applies to. The Galactic Council reviewed the declaration. The Council had a great talent for expressing concern in ways that carried no practical weight. They noted their concerns. They issued statements. They established a review subcommittee. They were not going to stop it. The hegemony fleet, 200 warships, was already moving. Ren was in the colony when the announcement went out. She had been there 4 months, which was longer than she usually stayed anywhere. Her ship needed work she couldn't do in deep space, and the colony had a decent enough yard, and her body had needed something that was not the inside of a freighter cabin. For a while, she read the declaration. She read it again. She sat with it for 2 days. Talked to nobody about it, which was her way. Let herself think it all the way through before she did anything. On the 3rd day, she went to the colony's communication center. She had a frequency she had built over 20 years. Not a military channel, not a commercial one, not anything in any official registry, a private thing accessible from certain hardware that was common in the deep freight lanes, the kind of hardware that old captains and long route traders tended to hold on to because it was reliable and because people in that line of work learned early not to throw away reliable things. She composed a message not long. She had never used words that weren't working for their place. 3 sentences. she sent it on 26 separate frequencies, each one adjusted slightly. For the person receiving it, the right language, the right form of address, the right tone for each one. She did not ask for help. She did not explain the numbers or describe what 60 days would mean for 40,000 people who had no other home. She just said, "I am calling." Then she sent it into the dark and waited to find out what kind of person she had been all those years. The hegemony fleet positioned itself in the space above the colony and waited. The fleet's officers ran their standard readiness checks and their standard monitoring protocols and their standard everything, because they were a professional organization, and professional organizations do the same things whether or not anything interesting is happening. Nothing interesting was happening. The colony was quiet. The sky above it was empty, except for the hegemony ships, the stars, and the particular quality of space in the outer rim that felt like something holding its breath. 58 days remained on the clock. 57, 56. Then on the morning of day 6, a sensor operator on the hegemony's lead vessel looked at her screen and said nothing for a moment, because she was making sure she was reading it correctly. She was reading it correctly. "Admiral," she said, "I have a contact." The signal was not dramatic. That was the first thing hegemony Admiral Draxon's intelligence division noted when they finally pulled the intercept records together weeks after everything had already happened. They had been monitoring all standard frequencies in the region in advance of the territorial declaration standard procedure, the kind of thing that usually returned nothing interesting. Their equipment was good. Their analysts were better. They had missed it completely, not because it was encrypted in a way that defeated their systems, because it was not on any frequency their systems were calibrated to look at, because it moved through hardware that had no official registration, using a format that existed in no commercial or military database, broadcasting in 26 slightly different versions of essentially the same 3 sentences. 3 sentences in 17 different languages. Each translation was slightly off from what an automatic system would produce. Not wrong, but personal. The way a translation is personal when it comes from someone who actually learned the language rather than fed it through a converter. Each version carried the specific weight of someone who had spent time with these words, who understood not just what they meant, but how they would land. "I am calling." That was the center of it in 26 different forms. The Vorath version used his clan name in the correct military honorific. The specific one you didn't know to use unless you had looked for it. The Theshan version used a commercial greeting that meant peer-to-peer, equal to equal. The Ki version, and this was the part that made one intelligence analyst get up from her desk and go find her supervisor immediately, because having a valid keel comms format was not something that happened. The keel version was simply the colony's coordinates in a form of address that translated as closely as their systems could manage to navigator. They remember 3 sentences, 26 frequencies. "I am calling." Vorath Kess heard it on the old unit on his shelf. He was eating breakfast. His wife was across the table talking about something. One of the grandchildren had done something funny, and he was paying proper attention because he loved these mornings in the way a person loves the things they thought they'd never have. It was a Tuesday. completely ordinary in every way a morning can be ordinary. The unit on the shelf blinked. He knew the routing header the moment he saw it, because he had noted it carefully too. Decades ago, the morning after that transmission about his granddaughter. He had sat for a long time that morning, thinking about what kind of person calls, after 22 years, just to share good news, with no request attached, and he had logged the frequency header in the place where he kept things he didn't want to lose. He got up and opened it. 3 sentences, his name spoken correctly. The colony's coordinates, I am calling. He stood at the shelf. He went to the back of the house and got his kit bag, the old one, the one he'd kept packed in a closet for 3 full years of retirement out of a habit he'd never managed to break. Flight suit, tools, personal rations, the small things. He had told himself he kept it packed because old habits died hard. He had never examined this too closely. His wife stood in the doorway. Who was it? She said. A debt, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. She had been with him for 30 years. She knew the difference between his faces. How long? She said. I don't know. She nodded. That was all. 30 years with a person who had been a soldier and then a freight runner meant understanding the difference between the things you could ask about and the things you couldn't, and understanding that the things you couldn't ask about were sometimes the ones that mattered most. He kissed her. He picked up the bag. He walked to the landing field he had been watching for 3 years. The young captain who shipped up said in Bay 7 was in the middle of his morning maintenance check when a retired Voreth cargo veteran in an old flight suit walked up to him and said, without any preamble at all, 1 Cland, I need your ship for an indefinite period. I will pay your daily operating rate times 3, cover all fuel and maintenance costs, and return it without a mark on it. The young captain stared at him. I'm Voreth Kess, the older man said. You'll have heard the name or you haven't. Either way, you can check my license, which is still valid, and my flight record, which is available in the public registry. 2491. The young captain had heard the name. Everyone who flew freight in this sector had heard the name. Where are you going? The young captain said. To collect on something, Voreth Kess said. Do we have a deal? Sailor was in the middle of a negotiation. The conference room on her flagship, which she called a conference room but was really just the largest cabin on the ship with a better table in it, had become, over the past 40 minutes, a place where a Drethian buyer was making the same core argument in a slightly different arrangement of words, apparently operating on the theory that the right order of sentences would eventually produce a different answer. He wanted a 12% reduction on her Eastern Corridor freight contracts. He had given 6 reasons, all of which had been addressed. He was cycling back through them now. Sayla had the expression she always wore in negotiations, neutral, attentive, radiating a polite patience that was completely artificial and concealed total absence of interest in any outcome. That didn't end with her original number. Her personal unit sat on the table. She kept it visible in meetings because there were exactly 4 people whose communications she would interrupt a negotiation for. She wanted to know if any of them needed sorry. Unquote. The unit lit up, not a standard alert light. The routing header in the corner of the screen was the one she had kept logged for years. The header she had pulled from that trade arbitration document a long time ago and stored, without knowing why except that she was a merchant and merchants kept track of things that didn't yet have an explanation. She looked at the unit. She looked at the Drethian buyer who was currently explaining for the second time the impact of fuel costs in Sector 11 on his operational margins. She picked up the unit. She read the message. She stood up. "My apologies," she said to the buyer in the tone that was polite and not particularly sorry. "I have a prior obligation that requires my immediate attention. We will reschedule." The buyer stared at her. "We are in the middle of we'll reschedule," she said and left. Breath found her on the bridge 2 minutes later, standing at the navigation console, staring at the coordinates already loaded on the screen. Outer rim far sector, human colony territory. "What happened?" he said. "We need to move. Full engines. We have a negotiation." Breath. She turned and looked at him, and something in her face closed the next sentence before it started. "I know what we have. We're going." He looked at the coordinates. "Who's calling?" Sayla thought about a dock that smelled like engine grease and overripe grain, a human with a kit bag, and the face of someone who had looked at their situation clearly and decided to deal with it. 3 days of work. A calibration fix nobody asked for. A trade report that arrived out of nowhere and won her a case she'd been losing slowly for 8 months. "Someone oh," she said, "get us moving." Keel. And one breathless article in a popular science publication that described it as unprecedented in 4 centuries of observation. The Keel were not a species many people understood well, because the Keel were not a species that invited understanding. They were very old, and they moved through space by means that other civilizations had been attempting to reverse engineer for 200 years without success. And when they stopped moving, the scientific consensus was that they stopped because they chose to, and that was the end of any explanation available. The navigator had not explained his reasons for stopping 11 years ago. His first mate, a position more honorary than functional on a ship that didn't require assistance navigating, had stopped expecting him to. The ship sat. Time passed. The first mate kept the systems maintained and kept his own counsel. The morning the signal came, the first mate was in the lower maintenance bay doing routine work. He felt the first sign before he understood it, a low vibration moving up through the hull and into the soles of his feet. He stood up. He knew that vibration. He had felt it hundreds of times over decades of service on this ship. It was the primary drive warming up. He went to the bridge. The navigator was already there, standing at the navigation console in the way he always stood, very still, in the manner of something that had learned stillness as a choice rather than just a state. The navigation display was active, coordinates loaded. A colony system in human outer rim space. "Navigator," the first mate said. The navigator did not turn. "We received a signal," the first mate said. "Yes." "From a human." "Yes." The first mate stood there while the drive vibration deepened under their feet. The ship that had not moved in 11 years was warming its engines with the calm certainty of something that had never had any doubt about what it was going to do when this moment came. "Why?" the first mate said. The navigator was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was choosing words rather than just finding them. She asked for charts, he said, when no one else would have given them. The first mate waited for more, no more. The engines came fully online. The ship began to move. 41 ships answered. They came from different places, different routes, different reasons. Though the reasons all had the same shape underneath, they had no knowledge of each other in transit, no communication between them, no coordination that any monitoring system would have been able to detect. Retired Vorath captain in a borrowed ship flying like he had never stopped. 9-ship Theshan commercial fleet, pushing its engines in ways the maintenance logs would have things to say about. A keel vessel that moved through space the way very old things move, without urgency, without doubt, and others. A Drethian freighter captain who had once received accurate hazard data for a dangerous run and had searched for the source for 7 years without finding it. A Murin trade official whose most important professional introduction, the one that had made his entire career possible, had been arranged by a human contact he had never been able to properly thank. A Gathani survey crew whose lost equipment had been returned to them in full working order by a freight runner who had found it drifting, gone 20 hours out of her way to bring it home, and refused any payment. And beyond these, other still people who had received the signal and told one other person who they thought should know, and that person had come without being called at all. 41 ships, 17 species, no fleet formation, no unified command, no treaty, no council mandate, no legal authority of any kind, just 41 captains who had received 3 sentences on an unofficial frequency and had gotten up and gone. The math had not been complicated for any of them. They knew what they owed. On the 6th day after the hegemony fleet's arrival, the sensor operator on the lead vessel looked at her screen. She checked it twice. "Admiral," she said, "I have a contact. Vorath registration, old military, converted commercial class, coming in from the outer rim bearing, no fleet markings, single vessel, Admiral Draxon." Noted it, unusual, not necessarily meaningful. Then a second contact 8 hours later, a third, then across the following 30 hours. A procession that is tactical officer, the best in the fleet, a woman who had never been rattled in 20 years of service, reported with increasing precision and decreasing confidence in her ability to explain what she was looking at. Different registry systems, different species, different configurations of vessel, no common markings, no common formation, no communications between them that signals intelligence could detect. They arrived on their own trajectories from their own directions, and they positioned themselves in the space between the colony and the fleet in an arrangement that was either meaningless or very specifically deliberate, and no one on Draxon's staff could determine which. By the count of 20, his first officer had stopped trying to find a tactical category for what he was seeing. By the count of 30, the bridge of the hegemony flagship had taken on the particular quality of quiet that a space takes on when professional people are watching, something none of their training has prepared them for. "How many?" Draxon said. 38, sir," his tactical officer said, still arriving. A pause. "Their weapon status?" "Armed, sir, most of them commercial grade, some modified." Another pause. "No weapons. Hot?" "They Were just there, not pointing anything at anyone, not broadcasting threats, not issuing any challenges. Doctrine knew how to answer, sitting in the gap between his fleet and the colony, steady and quiet and completely, immovably present. Pull the identification on the large vessel, Draxon said. The dark one. Bottom left of my screen. His tactical officer ran the query. She turned from her console. Admiral, she said, it's returning as a keel vessel. Draxon had been in the hegemony Navy for 30 years. He had fought 5 engagements and survived 3 that most people did not. He had been in the presence of genuinely dangerous things more times than he could count without sitting down with a list. He was not a man who was easily surprised. He looked at the keel ship. The keel had not, to anyone's knowledge, taken a position on any matter in 400 years. They moved, they navigated, they kept to themselves with the thoroughness of something that had decided long ago that the concerns of younger civilizations were not their concern. The keel were here. Draxon stood at his scanner for a long time and said nothing, then quietly, keep all positions, no weapons, no aggressive posture. I want every one of those ships monitored, and I want to know the moment anything changes. Yes, sir. He stood there. He counted 39, 40, 41. They stopped arriving at 41, as if that number had always been the number, and they had simply been finding their way to it. Draxon looked at 41 ships from 17 species with no unified command and no legal authority and no apparent military purpose, positioned between his fleet and a colony of 40,000 people. He felt for the first time in his professional life that he was looking at something he did not have a single word for. Open a channel, he said. General broadcast, all of them. Draxon's voice was the voice he used for official communications, level, clear, carrying the weight of his rank without needing to announce it. He had used this voice for 30 years, and he was good at it. It did not waver. Unidentified vessels in sector. You are operating without treaty authority, without council mandate, and without military jurisdiction in a declared hegemony territorial zone. State your purpose or be treated as hostile. His bridge was very quiet. 41 ships sat in their positions between the fleet and the colony, steady and silent. On the scanner screens the way landmarks are silent. 30 seconds, then a single channel opened. Not all 41 at once, just one, from the Voreth vessel that had been the first to arrive. The voice that came through was old and unhurried, and it carried the quality of a person who had learned to say important things sparingly, so that when they said them, the words carried the full weight they were meant to carry. Admiral, the voice said. Captain, Draxon said. State your purpose. We owe a debt. Draxon absorbed this. To the colony, to someone in it, one person. Yes, the simplicity of it was nearly offensive. He was looking at the most unusual assembly of vessels he had encountered in 30 years of service, and the explanation sitting across from him was 2 words: a debt. I have 200 warships, Draxon said. I know. Voreth captain said, you are 41 vessels with no formal alliance, no military authority, and no legal standing to obstruct a declared territorial resolution. I know that too. Then you understand your position. A pause, not a thinking pause, the pause of someone who has already thought this through completely and is now simply deciding how much to say, We understand it. Voreth Captain said. We came anyway. Draxon opened the general channel broadcasting to all 41. Simultaneously, all vessels. This is Admiral Draxon of the Hegemony 3rd Fleet. You are in violation of hegemony. Territorial declarations. I am formally requesting your immediate withdrawal. You have no authority here. You have no standing here. I am asking you to leave. Silence, not the silence of empty space. The silence of 41 ships on the same channel, all of them quiet at the same moment. Then the channel opened, not one voice, not a coordinated announcement, but all 41 simultaneously, each in their own language, each in their own voice, each in the specific tone and register of their own species and their own nature, but landing close enough together that the combined sound hit the bridge of the Hegemony flagship like a single held note. We owe a debt. 17 languages, 17 ways of saying it. In divide the keel version didn't translate to those exact words. The closest the translation system could produce was times an obligation that does not expire. The Theshan version was a commercial term, the kind used for a contract that supersedes any subsequent agreement. The Voreth version was the word they used for the bond between people who had bled together in the same place fighting the same fight. Different words, one meaning. Draxon's first officer was looking at the scanner with the expression of a man who has received a piece of information that his current framework cannot organize. Draxon's tactical officer was carefully not looking at anyone in the way of professionals who have witnessed something they are giving the admiral the privacy to absorb. Draxon stood at the center of his bridge and looked at his screen. He had a complete picture of the opposing force. He had been building it since the first vessel arrived. Registry histories, ship classifications, armament ratings, current positioning. He had 41 complete profiles. He had run the tactical calculation. He was not the kind of officer who avoided difficult numbers. The math was not close. 200 warships against 41 commercial and modified commercial vessels was not a contest by any established military doctrine. He had the numbers. He did not have a category. Who is the individual? He said. His voice was controlled and professional. The one they owe. Unknown at present, sir. His intelligence officer said. We're working on it. Work faster. He looked at the Voreth vessel, still at the same position it had taken when it arrived between his fleet and the colony. Unhurried, completely settled its place, showing no weapons and no aggression and no intention of moving. Captain, he said, opening the channel again to the Voreth ship alone, you were a military officer, decorated. You understand what I am looking at from a tactical position. You understand what I can do. Yes, Voreth Kess said. And you're staying. Yes. A moment of quiet. Give me a reason I can use. Draxon said. He was not asking for himself. He was asking for the report he would eventually have to file. Give me something I can put in a document. A treaty claim, a council petition, a formal grievance, something. A long pause from the other end. We have nothing like that, Voreth Kess said. Then what do you have? The debt, he said. That's all we have. And the certainty that it will be paid. Draxon closed the channel. He stood at the center of his bridge for a long time. Ren was in the colony's communications center. She had been there since the Ships began arriving, standing in front of the scanner feeds with the quiet attention of someone watching the answer to a question they had been carrying for a very long time. The feeds showed everything the hegemony fleet in its clean, professional formation above and the 41 scattered, irregular, completely improbable ships positioned between the colony's communications. Officer stood beside her. He was 24 years old and had been born in this colony and had no other home, and he had been watching the feeds with the expression of someone who is trying to understand something that is almost too large to see clearly. Do you know them? He said. The ships, some of them, Ren said. But not all. No, she had been sitting with this since the count passed 26. She had sent the signal to 26 people. The count was 41, which meant 15 ships were here because someone who received the signal had told someone else, and that person had come without being called at all. She had not expected that. She had hoped for a response. She had not calculated an overflow. Tay looked at her. How many people did you reach out to? 26. He looked at the screen. There are 41 ships. Yes, he stood with that for a moment. Did you know they would come? He said. Ren was quiet for a moment. She thought about a Vashik corridor and a ship that ran out of fuel in a place where ships shouldn't run out of fuel, and a Vorath captain who could have kept flying. She thought about a dock on Theshan 4 and a merchant who ran tight margins and tight schedules and had given her 3 days of work anyway, no questions, no favors. Ode, she thought about the edge of the mapped world and a voice that asked why a human wanted to go somewhere no one had been, and gave her the charts when she told the truth. She thought about 22 years of keeping track. I knew what I gave them, she said. Which was? Tay said. She watched Vorath Kess's borrowed ship holding its position on the screen, solid and still and completely immovable in the space between everything that wanted to end this colony and the colony itself. Reason to, she said. The standoff lasted 51 hours. Draxon ran the tactical analysis 4 times. The answer was the same each time. From every angle he approached it, he could win, probably at real cost and with the specific kind of mess that came from military action against non-military vessels from 17 different species, which would generate 17 different diplomatic complaints, 17 different council proceedings, and would become the kind of incident that followed a career rather than being filed away and forgotten. But he could win. That was not the problem. The problem was what he was looking at and his absolute inability to build a framework for it. He spent hours reading the profiles his intelligence division assembled on the vessels and their captains. He read each one. Vorath cargo, veteran, decorated military record, retired Theshan merchant fleet, successful commercial operator, a Gathani survey crew, a Drethian freighter captain, an Amuran trade official who had converted a personal ship for reasons that were not explained in the public registry, and the keel vessel which defied the kind of clean assessment he could make of the others. The connecting variable, his intelligence officer eventually found, was the human operator, the name in the records, the Outer Rim freight registration, the 20 years of routes nobody else ran, the pattern of returned favors that his intelligence analyst described in her report as inconsistent with known models of influence building, which was the Careful language for times we don't know what this is. He read it all. He tried to fit it into the doctrines he had spent 30 years mastering, the doctrines of force and deterrence and the careful management of power between entities that understood power in the traditional ways. He tried to find the leverage point, the negotiating position, the threat or the offer that would cause these 41 ships to recalculate and withdraw. There was no leverage point. You could not threaten a debt. You could not make someone reconsider gratitude. You could not file a diplomatic complaint against people who were not claiming any authority, who were explicitly not claiming any authority, who had arrived without a political position, without a legal framework, without any of the structures through which the galaxy normally managed conflict. They were just there. They had come because they wanted to come, because something in them had said times, yes, times to this in a way that no doctrine he possessed had a counter to. And they would stay because staying was the thing they had decided to do, and there was no mechanism available to him that changed what people had decided. He could shoot them. He could end it that way. He sat with that for a long time in his office, alone with his analysis. He was an honest man when it was only himself in the room. He could shoot them and 41 ships from 17 species, most of whom had no particular quarrel with the hegemony, would become 41 incidents, 17 sets of next of kin, 17 government responses ranging from formal protest to something worse, a keel ship destroyed by a hegemony fleet. He sat with that specific one for a long time because the keel were old and long-memoried in ways that no threat assessment model had ever successfully quantified, and at the end of it, a colony of 40,000 people relocated, and a stain on this operation that would never fully come clean. He went back to the bridge. Prepare withdrawal orders, he said. His first officer turned. Admiral, we are placing the territorial resolution under administrative review. Draxon said, pending situation assessment. Full withdrawal from the sector. Begin pre-jump procedures. A pause in the bridge that was brief and professional, and contained underneath it the specific quality of people who are very surprised and are being very careful not to show it. Yes, sir, his first officer said. Draxon stood at the viewport and watched the 41 ships as his fleet began its preparations. They did not celebrate. They did not move. They sat exactly where they had been sitting, steady in the dark, as if they had never once considered the possibility of a different outcome, and therefore had nothing particular to celebrate about this one. He watched them for a long time. He went to his desk and began writing his report. He was thorough. He always was. He documented every element, the assembly of the vessels, the species represented, the absence of any formal command structure, the communications, the tactical calculation, his reasoning for withdrawal. In the summary section he wrote, standard threat assessment models appear insufficient for this situation. Type, the assembled force operates outside established categories for military action, treaty alliance, or political organization. Recommend development of new analytical frameworks. Further recommend significant intelligence investment in human outer rim relationships, which appear to be of a nature and scope not previously assessed. He paused, added, one more line. The individual at the center of this situation, the human operator, does not appear to have used force, threat, money, or political authority to assemble this response. Further investigation of methodology is strongly recommended. What she used instead is not clearly defined in current intelligence vocabulary. He filed the report. He stood at the viewport a while longer, watching the stars of the outer rim, which looked the same as they always looked and were somehow entirely different from how they had been 51 hours ago. Something had happened here. He was a careful and intelligent man, and he was honest enough to know that he did not fully understand what it was. The landing bay on the colony's main settlement was not built to hold 41 ships. It held 3 on a good day. The overflow was parked on the flat scrubland outside the settlement's perimeter, the open ground that the first generation colonists had cleared for agriculture, and that the generations after them had kept clear, mostly out of habit. Ships of 17 different types and sizes and configurations sat on the rust-colored ground in the late afternoon light, and the colony's children stood at the perimeter fence and looked at them with the wide and unguarded attention of people who had grown up in a small place and were now watching the world at their door. Inside the bay where the captains had gathered, it was loud. Not the organized noise of a military debrief or a diplomatic meeting, just the noise of a large number of different species with different voice registers and different emotional baselines, all sharing the same space for the first time. The keel navigator stood near the far wall and was quiet with the completeness of something that had been quiet for a very long time and saw no reason to change that now. The Thessian merchant sail was talking with her first officer at a volume that suggested she had not quite switched out of captain mode despite being on the ground. 2 Gethani crew members were looking at the structural supports in the bay ceiling with the professional interest of people who are always working even when they aren't. A Drethian freighter captain sat on a crate with a container of food from his own ship, eating and watching the room with the patient expression of a man who had come a very long way and had no regrets about it and would not say no to a better chair. Wren had been working the room for 20 minutes, not working it the way diplomats work rooms, working it the way she did most things practically and specifically, making sure the visitors had what they needed, that the translation relays were running at full capacity, that the logistics team had the docking situation sorted, that the small practical things that accumulate when 41 ships land somewhere that was not expecting 41 ships were being handled, and while she did it she was saying thank you. She was good at it in her own way. She did not use the sweeping, theatrical kind of gratitude that makes people uncomfortable. She said it directly by name with the specific details of what each person had done acknowledged in plain terms. She thanked the Drethian captain by name and mentioned the difficult run he had made years ago, the one she had heard about through someone else long after it happened. She thanked the Gethani crew for the transit math she had run in her head. She knew what the trip had cost them in time. She worked through the room the way she worked through any problem, completely and methodically. She was halfway across the bay, moving toward the corner where Voreth K stood watching her. When he held up one hand, she stopped. The bay noticed, not all at once and not clears throat obviously, but the way rooms do when a person who doesn't usually speak is about to The noise settled itself down without anyone deciding to be quiet. Do not thank us, Vorath Case said, his voice carried without effort. 40 years of giving instructions in loud spaces had made it a voice that reached without straining. Ren looked at him. I was going to, she said. I know you were. He crossed the 3 steps that put them at a proper speaking distance. That is what you do. You pay close attention to people. You remember what matters to them, and then you find the right way to say the thing. It is one of the things about you. He paused. You should not thank us. You came here for me, she said. No. He said it plainly without sharpness. That is the thing you are getting wrong. She waited. He stood there for a moment, the way he always stood, contained and steady, taking the time to make sure he had it in the right order before he said it. You came to me in the Vashek corridor, he said. 22 years ago, your ship was broken and you needed fuel, and you had something to trade, and you made a deal that was commerce. I have made 10,000 deals. He paused and let that sit. You called me about my granddaughter. The room, which had been settling, went quieter still. You found my clan name, the one I stopped using after the war. You learned the correct form of address in my language, the specific one that takes research to know. You used a debt comms unit to reach an old retired captain on the other side of the sector. He looked at her to tell him that his granddaughter had done something worth knowing about. Nothing else. You wanted nothing. You needed nothing. You did it because you remembered him and because you thought it was a thing worth saying. Ren looked at him. It was just information, she started. No, the word was not harsh. Just certain, the way certain things are said by people who have thought them through completely and are no longer available to be argued out of them. Information is something you buy. Information is something you trade. What you gave me had no market value. It had no strategic value. It had no practical use. He paused and worked in his own language for a moment before finding the shape of the thing in hers. You gave me the feeling of being remembered by someone who had no reason to remember me. The bay was very quiet. Ren waited. We are species, Vorath Case said, and his voice had changed in a way that was subtle and total. The way a voice changes when someone is saying something that cost them something to understand, who measure value in what can be taken, in what can be held and proven and cited in a legal document. We measure strength in force. We measure relationships in what they produce. He looked around the room. The keel navigator at the wall, sail near the door with the expression of a person who is being moved by something and is extremely annoyed about it. The Gathani crew, the Drethian captain, who had set down his food and was listening with his full attention. We forgot something. He looked back at her. Not all of us, not completely, but enough that it stopped being the thing we counted on, enough that it stopped being something we expected to encounter. He was quiet for a moment. You gave it back. Ren said nothing. She was the kind of person who understood what silence was doing in a room and who respected work enough not to step on it. You showed us what kind of people we could still choose to be, Vorath Case said. By choosing it yourself, quietly, without announcing it, over 20 years in the freight lanes where nobody was watching and there was nothing to gain. He looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention that had always been his way. We did not come here to be thanked. We came here because something in each of Us answered when you called because you had made it possible for that something to answer. A pause. You cannot thank us for that. That belongs to you. The bay held the silence. Wren looked at him for a long moment. Voreth case, she said. Yes, thank you anyway. Something moved across his face. Not a smile. Voreth faces didn't do that the way human faces did, but the specific expression of someone who has been caught off guard by a thing they should have predicted, which is, in its own way, its own kind of pleasure. Yes, he said. All right. An hour later, Sale found her outside, sitting on a low wall at the edge of the landing area, looking at the ship spread out across the flat scrubland. The sun was going down over the rust-colored ground, and the ships caught the last of the light in 17 different ways, some gleaming, some absorbing it, some reflecting it in the particular colors of their hull materials, each one marked by the specific history of the work it had done, and the repairs it had survived, and the routes it had run. Sale sat down on the wall beside her. You knew we would come, she said, not entirely a question. I hoped. Wren said. That's not an answer. No, Wren said. It's not. She was quiet. For a moment, I knew what I had given people. I didn't know if it would be enough to matter when something actually needed it to matter. That's the part you can't calculate. Sale sat with this. 15 ships came that you didn't call, she said. Yes. I told 3 people when I got the signal. Sale said. Not because I needed to. Because it seemed like the kind of thing other people should know about, I think. Others did the same. Wren watched the ships on the flat ground. You fixed my calibration error, Sale said after a while. Her voice was quieter. 11 months we had that fault. You found it in 2 days, and you fixed it without saying a word to anyone. It needed fixing. You didn't have to. You didn't have to give me the berth, Wren said, or the work or the meals. Sale was quiet. I gave you that because it was a fair exchange. You gave me that, Wren said, because you're a good person who decided to be practical about it. Those are not the same thing as each other, but they're not in conflict either. Sale looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone reassessing calculation. They sat with the sunset for a while. The colony's lights were coming on one by one in the settlement behind them. The warm yellow kind, domestic and specific, the kind of light that means people in buildings making dinner and putting children to bed and doing the ordinary things people do on ordinary evenings when the crisis has passed, and they are still there to do them. Where will you go after this? Sale said. Not sure yet. There are some routes in the outer rim that haven't been properly mapped because no one has been out there. That's usually enough reason. Sale looked at her. You're going to keep doing this, running the routes nobody else runs, helping people nobody asked you to help, remembering everyone. I'm going to keep doing my job, Wren said. That is your job, Sale said. The actual one, not the freight. Wren didn't answer. The last light went off. The ship spread out on the flat ground, and the stars came up over the rust-colored scrubland of a colony that was still there, and the night was quiet and full. The Galactic Trade Council Strategic Affairs Division submitted its formal assessment 8 weeks later. 7 analysts, 412 pages. Every element of the incident documented and cross-referenced: the assembly of vessels, their registry histories, the species represented, the absence of formal command structure, the hegemonies, withdrawal, The tactical end. Implications. The report's conclusions were careful and thorough, and in several key sections candid about the limits of the existing analytical vocabulary for what had been observed. The individual at the center of the incident was described as a human commercial operator of significant and underappreciated influence in outer rim networks whose methods of relationship building differ substantially from established models of political or commercial influence and do not map cleanly onto existing strategic frameworks. The report recommended further intelligence gathering, further monitoring, and the development of new analytical tools for understanding cross-species cooperative structures that operated outside formal treaty systems. It was a good report. It did not quite have a word for what it was describing. The eldest member of the Galactic Trade Council was a Murin named Vale. She was 412 years old, which was not the oldest anyone on the council had ever been, but was old enough to carry a specific quality, not the tiredness of age, not the distance of it, but the particular stillness of someone who has been paying attention for a very long time and has become very good at it. She sat at the head of the chamber table with the easy patience of something that has stopped being in a hurry. She had been observing humans since before most of the people currently in this chamber had been born. She had watched them arrive in the wider galaxy, cautious at first, then curious, then startling, specific ways that young species are. Sometimes startling, not through force or size or the conventional markers of significance, but through something harder to categorize and harder to counter. She had watched the other civilizations assess them and get the assessment wrong in the same way, again and again. Too soft, too scattered, no unified power, no conventional survival mechanism. They always forgot to account for the other thing. The young council member to her left, a Prothean 3 years in his position, sharp and ambitious, and still building his understanding of how the galaxy actually worked beneath its official surfaces, had been speaking for several minutes about the incident report and the need for new threat assessment frameworks and the strategic implications of a spontaneous cross-species non-aligned force assembled without formal coordination. We need a classification, he said, something that fits what assembled out there, a tactical category or at least a political one, because if this can happen once, it will happen again, and we need analytical tools that can engage with it. Vale looked at the report on the table in front of her. She had read it. She had also spoken informally with 2 of the captains who had been present, spoken with them the way she talked to people when she wanted to understand something rather than document it. She had listened carefully. She had asked very few questions. It is not a tactical category, she said. Young member looked at her. Then what is it? She thought about 400 years of watching civilizations grow and trade and fight and negotiate and build their elaborate structures for managing power and influence and survival. She thought about what they forgot over time as they grew large and complex and formal in their arrangements. She thought about the specific and recurring thing that slipped out of the official vocabularies. They have a word for it, she said. The chamber waited. She thought about a human freight runner with a cracked reader screen sitting calm in a broken ship, waiting for someone to come, ready to make a fair trade when they did. A navigation error fixed quietly without announcement by a person who expected nothing for it. Charts given at the edge of the mapped world to someone who simply wanted to go where no one had 20 years of paying attention in the places where no one was watching. 26 signals sent into the dark, 41 answers, a hegemony fleet that turned around not because it was outgunned, but because it encountered something its entire doctrine had no language for. What kind of person does that? The kind who pays attention, the kind who remembers, the kind who makes it possible for something in people to answer when called, something that was always there, waiting in the quiet, underneath all the strategies and the leverage and the management of power, waiting to be given a reason. She looked at the young member, she looked at the chamber. They have a word for it, she said again. What word? The young member said, friendship. Ships left the colony over the following 3 days, one by one and in small groups, going back to the roots and the systems and the work they had come from. The Drethian captain left first early in the morning, with a nod toward the colony that was brief and complete. The Gethani crew stayed an extra day because 2 of them had gotten involved in helping repair section of the colony's agricultural infrastructure and were not finished and didn't feel right leaving something unfinished. Sales fleet departed in the late afternoon of the second day in the organized way of a merchant who has been away from her business longer than she planned and is already running the numbers. The keel navigator's ship left last. It was there in the morning still, and enormous and dark against the pale sky. And then the first mate looked up from his work and it was not there the way it had first arrived, simply, completely without transition. Vorath Kess left on the second day. He stood with Ren for a few minutes outside Bay 3 in the morning light before he walked back to the borrowed ship. He had to return to a young captain who had probably been anxious about it the whole time. They did not say much. Neither of them were people who used words that weren't doing something. Will you come back? Ren said. He thought about this with the seriousness he gave to real questions. My granddaughter is 17, he said. She wants to fly freight. She wants the outer rim routes. He looked at Ren for a moment. When she is ready, I will bring her to the person who knows them best. Ren looked at him. I'll be somewhere in the outer rim, she said. I know, he said. I'll find the frequency. He picked up his kit bag. He walked to the landing field. He watched the colony recede on his aft scanner as he broke atmosphere. The rust-colored ground going small and then smaller and then becoming the particular beautiful smallness of a world seen from space, whole and specific and irreplaceable in the way that every place is irreplaceable to the people for whom it is home. He watched it until it was gone. He set his course. He flew